Now, listen, I beat the genes. My dad is 5'2" and my mom's 5'4". So I always tell my students that, I was born in the Shire to hobbits, even though you can't tell.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy. Good morning, Dr. Crane.
Okay, James, we got to clear the air.
Okay.
I'm a little nervous about something here.
What's that?
Well, I take one trip to a conference in Nashville, and then you're already taking meetings with replacement guest hosts.
Hey, well, it just doesn't feel right being in the studio by yourself, you know? So you need to...
Fair enough.
I had to have somebody to, fill the space.
I just didn't realize how replaceable I was.
Oh, you're not. You're not.
Now, I will say, I did listen to the pre-release. It was very good. I am actually sad I missed that guest. That was particularly interesting stuff.
It was a good conversation. I was really, really excited that we were able to schedule a conversation with Robert Lighton, and he did a good job of explaining some of his thoughts on things.
I enjoyed it. Now, speaking of that conference, I secured as a guest today,
right,
that I met at a conference a year ago that I was just enamored with her work. I thought it was really interesting. I was so inspired by it. I basically got on the plane, rushed home, and just banged out a paper within a couple of weeks because I was just, she gave me such great ideas. And so I'm hoping we'll get to explore her work today.
Yeah. That sounds good. Why don't you introduce our guest?
Sure. Our guest today is Dr. Emily McWilliams. She got her PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 2016. She is now a philosophy professor at the University of Dayton, formerly an assistant professor of philosophy at Duke Kunshan University. Dr. McWilliams specializes in epistemology and moral philosophy. And today we want to talk to her about her work on testimonial withdrawal. But before we get there, we've got the rapid fire get to know you questions, of course.
Yes. So we have to, we blitz you with some questions up front just to kind of introduce you a little bit more to our audience. So first question out of the gate, how'd you get into academia?
I think I kind of fell into it probably the way that many people fall into it. I always liked school as a kid. I was one of those kids, and I didn't want to leave when it was time to leave. And so I just never left. I really enjoyed doing philosophy and couldn't think of anything else that I sort of wanted to do more than continuing to do it. I'm not one of these people who thinks there's no other good life and that I couldn't imagine a different kind of life, but I didn't want one. So I didn't pursue it.
All right. What's one interesting thing you're currently reading, listening to, or watching? Your pick.
Listening to. So the thing that I've been, because I'm in the process of moving jobs and moving countries, I've been packing a lot. And so needing a lot of things to listen to. So the podcast that I've recently been listening to is called Petty Crimes. I don't know if you've heard of it or if you listen to it, but it's their tagline is that it's the only true crimes podcast that investigates non-crimes.
Non-crimes.
And so it's, but sort of in the style of a true crime podcast. And it's people being, like cases of people being petty or violating social norms or being annoying. And then they decide whether that person was in the wrong. And if they were in the wrong, like what their punishment ought to be, sort of ideally. And then at the end, they have this rapid fire part called criminal or minimal, where they just rapid fire ask questions about like violations of various social norms and then judge whether it's criminal criminal or minimal. I just think it's a lot of fun. It's not a super serious podcast, and it doesn't take itself seriously, but it's been very entertaining for my my month-long packing journey.
This one's an easy one. You ready? Who is the greatest philosopher of all time?
Oh, easiest question. I struggle with this question. Whenever I've been asked it, it kind of stumps me. Just because I think there's so many different ways of being great from different intellectual traditions. So I'm just going to go with one that I liked. When I was a student, I always really enjoyed reading Plato. I once in a while still regret that I never, pursued that further. I was just kind of lazy, and it would require me to learn to read Greek, and that seemed like a huge thing. But he's very funny, and it has all these qualities of nice and enjoyable writing that maybe contemporary analytic philosophy doesn't have. You sort of, the more you read it, the more you get out of it. Each time you get something new, and kind of the form is as interesting as the content is. So, I sort of miss my student days of taking classes on Plato and spending hours doing close readings of that.
Well, Emily, we were almost friends.
I was going to say, you don't know how much you warmed Guy's heart by choosing Plato.
Was never, ever, ever my favorite. But that's okay. That's okay. Philosophy's a big tent. That's okay.
What is one thing about your work you wish people understood better?
So I don't really feel that people misunderstand me. I do think that that I wish people understood we as philosophers better in general, or that we as philosophers had a better sort of reputation for doing work that engages with the world, or that could make, a social or political difference in the world, even if it's just understanding the world better, because, that informs action too. So, I don't feel that my work is misunderstood, but I do feel that we as a community need to work on, making it the case that our work gets uptake beyond academic circles. So I feel like we're kind of a misunderstood epistemic community more broadly.
We might have a branding problem. I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's a branding problem. It's a big problem. We're not having the impact.
I think there's a lot of fields that have that
enough.
issue.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
Okay, fair enough.
I will say, as a political scientist, we always have a good deal of envy / frustration towards economists who seem to get all the attention. So I think there's a lot of us out there that are like, hey, we know some stuff too.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So what's a belief that you hold that puts you at odds with either your peers, colleagues, or family members?
I think in thinking about this, the only things that I, can come up with are sort of social norms that I don't like, or social norms that annoy me. I think it's weird that women always go to the bathroom together. I don't enjoy saying goodbye to everyone at a party before I leave, because that takes like another hour when you're already ready to leave.
Yeah.
I don't like that people greet each other with "How are you?" I think a lot of people don't like that, but there's sort of a collective action problem. But just the things that I think put me at odds with other people are just that I don't love all of our social norms that regulate our collective behavior.
I can get on board with that, I think. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Main event time, though.
Well,
yes?
I'm just going to say, as a guy, we don't have the social norm of going to the restroom together. I don't know how that developed. There's got to be some origin story there somewhere, right? As to how that became.
Yeah, maybe there's like a safety thing in certain contexts, and so that would make sense. But it really seems super unnecessary now. And like the idea that you would be like, "Oh, wait for me, I'll go with you." But why? We're not gonna, Anyway, I think it's silly.
I think I would love to see that SNL skit. It's not like it's been done before. So the SNL skit would be where all the sort of male comedians get together and they are embodying those kinds of female gendered social norms. And you start to realize like, wow, that looks weird. Yeah, because it's just weird, not because they're doing it, right? Like, yeah.
It is just weird. That would be a great kind of skit. Yeah.
So your specialization is in epistemology. And for our non-philosopher listeners like myself, can you give us a brief idea of what epistemology is, and maybe more specifically, what social epistemology is?
Yeah, absolutely. So epistemology is traditionally kind of the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge. So it looks at questions of what knowledge is, what justified belief is, perhaps as a component of knowledge, and then how we acquire and disseminate knowledge. So that's kind of the traditional definition. I think one exciting thing about being in epistemology right now is that it's getting broader, or that the range of things that people are concerned with or focusing on in the past 20 years just continues to broaden, particularly with fields like social epistemology. So I think there's now more kind of focus on the social processes of how we seek and acquire and process and respond to information in the world, and how we exchange that information with each other, and how we interact in that process and depend on one another in various ways. And of course, how, social and political factors shape and play various roles in all of that. So that is kind of social epistemology. And I think it gives us sort of a broader understanding of epistemology itself in the current moment. So I would say that rather than just the study of knowledge, epistemology is something like the study of both individual and collective processes and pursuits that aim at getting us a better grasp of the world, or something like that. And then social epistemology focuses on how we're interdependent and dependent on one another in those processes.
What I've come to really appreciate about social epistemology is that it sheds light on stuff that happens like all the time, but is like deceptively simple. So when it comes to I'm thinking here, like when it comes to the ethics or mechanics of communication, it can seem like there's not a whole lot of moving parts. So, right, like on the speaker side, there's just somebody who's saying stuff and they're either being honest or lying. And then on like the listener side, there's just a person who might risk believing somebody they shouldn't, or disbelieving somebody that they should have believed. But work in social epistemology suggests that the sort of the flora and fauna of everyday communication is just a lot more diverse than that, doesn't it? So I'm thinking about when you are writing about ways in which marginalized persons can be silenced by hearers, you write that it's important to understand the different ways this can happen. Can you elaborate on why that's the case?
Yeah, I think that what you said is quite right. I think it's important for exactly the reason that you just gave, which is because we won't be able to see it otherwise, because it does seem like communication and testimony are just these simple everyday things. But, really the ways that I choose to communicate or I choose not to communicate, and the ways that you receive and respond to information that I aim to communicate is much more complex. It's not just whether you think I'm lying, but how much credibility you give me as a knower, how you weigh that information against your information and your own beliefs, whether it motivates you to go out and do further inquiry on your own or tell other people about what I said so that my information moves through a social network, whether you forget what I said a few minutes after I said it, or whether you then, go on to use it in your own practical and intellectual pursuits. I think all of that is stuff that is, interesting and complex and influenced by social and political factors, and that we won't see that, or we won't understand it without the work of social epistemology. And, if we don't see it, then of course we can't think about how we might want to intervene, how we might want to change things or do things differently or better for the sake of epistemic improvement, but also moral improvement.
All right. So in preparation for our conversation, we read your paper on testimonial withdrawal. And there are a few terms in there that I think you use that are commonly understood differently than how you use them in your work. And so I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit and see if you can kind of elaborate and maybe explain how you use terms like testimony, injustice, and violence in that particular paper.
Yeah, when you hear testimony, I think you'd normally think of like testimony in a courtroom. But in the epistemic injustice literature, it's not supposed to be restricted to those, formal or legal settings. So it's just used to refer to sharing epistemic goods, things like knowledge and beliefs, or, broadly conveying information to each other verbally in any sort of context. So, you can draw wider or narrower boundaries around what that means. So a philosopher called Christopher Hookway pointed this out with respect to the epistemic injustice literature, that, we can draw wide boundaries around testimony so that it's not just assertion or telling people things, but it can include, asking questions, floating ideas, suggesting directions for a conversation, all of these other kinds of things that are not just assertion. So I like that understanding because I think it sort of helps us include a lot of the moves that we make in shared inquiry and epistemic pursuits. Injustice was one of the other words you mentioned. I don't think we're using it in a particularly technical sense in the epistemic injustice literature. So we're intending anyway to talk about stuff that is genuinely unjust or unjust in kind of the broader sense. But what we're adding is that it's a distinctly epistemic kind of injustice that we're interested in thinking about. So that is the way that Fricker puts it. So an injustice against a person in their capacity as an epistemic agent specifically. And then the last word you mentioned was violence. So that is used in the context of epistemic violence. And there it is meant to be metaphorical, not literal. So it doesn't mean physical violence. The term epistemic violence comes from Spivak and also more recently work by Christy Dotson. And for Dotson, epistemic violence is this umbrella term for the different practices of silencing that she theorizes. And they all involve some failure of communication owing to pernicious ignorance, which is just reliable ignorance that harms a group of people. So violence there as not physical violence, but metaphorical epistemic violence.
Okay, well, obviously, then you're drawing on a lot of prior work by other social epistemologists, and I to set your ideas up, I want to unpack some of theirs. Can you start by telling us about Miranda Fricker's concept of testimonial injustice? What exactly is that for her, and why does it matter?
Yeah. So testimonial injustice is what happens when someone is trying to convey knowledge through testimony, and they are subject to what she calls an identity prejudicial credibility deficit. So either they're not believed at all, or they're just not given the credibility that they should be. So to put that another way, testimonial injustice happens when a person's testimony is not given enough credit for what they say because of a prejudice that is associated with their marginalized social identity. So things like their race, gender, or class or ability. Fricker herself is not the originator of this set of ideas. She's not the first to discuss the idea that marginalized speakers' testimony can be silenced because of these unjust power relations. She's drawing on, I think, a lot of earlier work in feminism and in critical race theory, particularly by women of color. But she has coined this term for it and given a specific analysis of the phenomenon. And I think it it matters because it gives us, a concept and a term, and that helps, as we said earlier, make the phenomenon visible to us and understand it and communicate about it. It has also been important because it just has sparked a huge amount of interest and response, and sort of this literature, blew up after Fricker's book. And that has given us a better understanding of the social and political dimensions of epistemic practices more broadly.
Okay. Christy Dotson has also worked on some things called testimonial violence and testimonial smothering. Can you kind of walk us through those concepts as well, and kind of explain to us what is meant by that?
Yes, absolutely. So Dotson's work is focused on how systems can undermine and hinder epistemic agency. So testimonial violence is an umbrella category for her for the kind of epistemic violence that occurs in exchanges of testimony. And under that are different practices of silencing of marginalized testimony. One of those practices, and the main one that I engage with, is what you asked about, which is testimonial smothering. And in testimonial smothering, a marginalized agent chooses not to offer testimony. So they choose not to speak in the first place, not to say anything at all, because they perceive their audience as either unwilling or unable to give appropriate uptake to that testimony because of the audience's pernicious ignorance. So, imagine that I am a speaker interested in sharing knowledge about misogyny in academia, but I know that I'm in a room where I am, what I say about that is either not likely to be understood or not likely to be believed. In those cases, I might smother my own testimony. I might not say anything in the first place because I anticipate this kind of epistemic failure on the part of the audience. So that's a case in which I've smothered my own testimony.
I'm wondering how insidiously these things could happen. Do you think that most of the time speakers and hearers engage in this sort of thing without even realizing they're doing it? Or do you think most of the time people are well aware when they do this sort of thing?
Yes, I think it is insidious and that they're not aware that, in fact, I think the standard case is one where they're not aware. One where they are aware would be sort of a non-standard case of this stuff. So for Fricker, for testimonial injustice, I think part of her aim is to show us how this stuff can happen without anyone intending it, or perhaps without anyone being aware of it. And the same for Dotson. So for Dotson's testimonial smothering, it happens when someone is incompetent to receive testimony, as we were saying. So there's two kind of important components of that, of testimonial incompetence. So the first is an unwillingness or an inability to understand what someone is saying. And the second one is an inability to detect that about yourself. So you don't realize that you are disposed to this kind of epistemic failure. So in that sense, it is really insidious. And that's the standard case. Maybe there are other cases where a hearer might intentionally downgrade someone's testimony or, misunderstand them because of some bias against their social group. But I think that would be different from at least Fricker and Dotson's primary concerns. So insidious and unaware is kind of the standard case.
That makes a lot of sense in terms of like why this work is important, just to name these things, right? So in other words, it's precisely their insidiousness that like keeps them invisible to us, and why like somebody's got to shine the spotlight on sort of like what we're not aware of happening, right? Yeah, that sounds right. Wow, interesting. Well, I mean, that brings us to the idea you developed, I guess, testimonial withdrawal. What is testimonial withdrawal, and how does it differ from the other concepts that you've been talking about?
Yeah. So my kind of motivating thought here was that the literature on these different kinds of testimonial silencing was missing something really crucial. And as a result, maybe it was even kind of distorting our understanding of this general phenomenon of how epistemic injustice can target marginalized testimony, because it's only focused on cases with a particular sort of cause. So both Fricker and Dotson are focused on cases where the testifier or, the would-be testifier is silenced because of an epistemic failure on the audience's part. So the audience either doesn't give them the uptake they deserve or doesn't understand them or wouldn't be disposed to if they did speak. So the person is either not understood or not given due credibility because they're the target of systemic injustice. That stuff I think is very important to understand, but I think that just as often, or maybe more often, the silencing that happens in discourse and exchanges of testimony comes from marginalized groups being just intimidated or dissuaded from speaking in the first place. So sort of intimidated into silence, not because they wouldn't be believed or wouldn't be understood, but because of the practical consequences that come with speaking and that they anticipate, because marginalized speech is often punished. So if that basic thought is right, then we can have epistemic injustice in the realm of testimony that does not come from an epistemic failure on the part of the audience, but just from the practical constraints and the practical risk that come with having an unjust lack of power. So similarly to the other kinds of testimonial injustice and violence, you don't get to make your epistemic contribution because of the ways that marginalized testimony is targeted by systemic injustice. So the formal definition of testimonial withdrawal that I give is that it is what occurs when a would-be speaker chooses to remain silent because they know or they reasonably expect that there is practical risk associated with speaking, where that risk is predictable because it arises from unjust and systemic constraints on marginalized speech. So to take a simple example, if you suppose you're someone in an unsafe work environment, a physically unsafe work environment, but you know that if you speak out about this, the most likely result is not safer working conditions, but just losing that job. You might choose not to speak, and that would be quite a reasonable choice. Or imagine any situation where a person doesn't speak about something because they don't want to out themselves as a member of some marginalized group. So either as being queer or having a non-apparent disability or a stigmatized health condition. In all those cases, it's not that you wouldn't be believed or understood, but it's fear of the negative consequences of being believed. So that's testimonial withdrawal. I think the closest concept to it in the prior literature is Dotson's testimonial smothering. What they have in common is that in both cases, the person chooses not to speak at all. They refrain from speaking. But the reasons for it are different. So in Dotson's cases, as we said, it's because they're anticipating epistemic failure on the audience's part. And in my cases, in testimonial withdrawal, it's because there are practical risks associated with marginalized speech. And so it can be very reasonable to just choose to remain silent.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that for just a second. The kind of the practical consequences, because it seems like someone could smother or withdraw their own testimony for all kinds of reasons, but you're linking these specifically to a speaker's kind of marginalized status, and so I'd like you to kind of elaborate a little bit more about the pragmatic risk that such a speaker might face when it's specifically linked to a speaker's being unjustly marginalized.
Yeah, that's a nice point, because that's important to its being epistemic injustice. So we, as you say, we withhold testimony for all kinds of reasons. If, I'm having a conversation that is taking its time to wind down and I feel as if I'm finished with this conversation, I might choose not to open a new thread just to end it. But that's not any kind of injustice. So it's important for its being, for the claim that it's a central kind of testimonial injustice, that it results from, the risk results from its being marginalized testimony. So It has to have, in other words, it has to have the right kind of connection to systemic injustice. The risk has to stem from your being targeted by systems of injustice, I think. And, marginalized testimony is often seen as a threat to power or to the legitimacy of power. So any case of marginalized groups speaking truth to power is likely to be punished for that reason.
Yeah, I think I could imagine how this would be connected to, say, a speaker's like gender or ability or race. I really enjoyed, you give an example though that like instantly made me smile. You talk about how easily this could happen, say, in a department or committee meeting in an academic setting. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So my personal opinion is that there's all kinds of unjust distributions of power that shape academic meetings and academic settings. I think that's one of the reasons that, untenured faculty members, particularly if they have other marginalized identities, are often given this advice to pick your battles carefully until you have tenure. That's kind of a standard piece of advice. That's because when, your interlocutors in these settings are your senior colleagues, they often have power over how your life goes in important respects. So if you offer testimony that forces them to confront or make salient something that they don't like, if you, again, speak truth to power, they might punish you for that. I think this kind of example that I give is a little bit messy because you might argue that, look, there's nothing unjust about the fact that some folks lack tenure and those who have it have power over how, untenured faculty members' lives go. There's nothing unjust about the tenure system. But regardless, I think of what you think about that, there's a kind of structural injustice here in the contradiction between, we have this avowed model of faculty governance where everyone's voice is equal, everyone has an equal say in these meetings, but the reality is that that's not actually possible in a setting where some people have significant power over how other people's lives go. So I think that's a kind of structural injustice itself.
Yeah, I want to follow up with that kind of situation because it's obviously one we can all relate to. Because as I was reading your paper, I was sitting here thinking, there have been times I've been in meetings and I've withheld my opinion on a topic specifically because I knew it was counter to the views of others in the room. And expressing it could cost me some amount of influence with my colleagues or the ability to be included on future projects or perhaps even a tenure vote, right? So if I understand you right, that would still be testimonial withdrawal just based on my impression of how the audience might react rather than what their actual reaction would have been. And if that's right, it seems like we've all been in these kinds of situations, that there's none of us that haven't been in some type of situation where we felt exactly that way. And if that's the case, are we in danger of kind of developing a concept that is overly broad, maybe, or misdiagnoses the problem? That really started thinking my mind in okay, how do I apply this in a situation given that I can't think of any person that hasn't felt this way at some point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. It's something that shapes all kinds of interactions. I think importantly for it to count as testimonial withdrawal, in my sense anyway, it has to be the case that practical risk is predictable because your speech is marginalized speech. Now, we just mentioned how you might argue about whether untenured speech counts as marginalized speech. But, if we suppose that there are no unjust distributions of power that are targeting your speech as marginalized speech, then it wouldn't count as testimonial withdrawal. One thing I haven't, I think, explained yet and maybe should here is what counts as marginalized speech. You might assume it's just speech by members of marginalized groups. But there's some recent work. There's two papers. One is by Robin Dembroff and Dennis Whitcomb, and another one is by Emmeline Davis, where they point out that testimonial injustice can be based not just on the identity of the speaker, but the content of their speech. So they call it, I think one of the papers calls it content-focused testimonial injustice, and the other one calls it content-based testimonial injustice, and I can't remember which is which. But in any case, the point is that it might be that the speaker themselves is not a member of any marginalized social group, but their speech, the content of what they're saying, is either about or associated with a marginalized group, and it's subject to testimonial injustice on that basis. So in the Dembroff and Whitcomb paper, they point out that you could have, a dominantly situated heterosexual cisgender white man who suffers a prejudicial credibility deficit when they offer testimony about, the HIV and AIDS crisis. And that's not because the speaker is targeted by prejudicial stereotypes, but because his testimony is either about or associated with a group that is targeted in that way. So the speech is targeted by systems of injustice, but the speaker, in virtue of their social identity, is not. I think there are kind of interesting questions here about who the injustice is against, whether it's against the speaker in that case or the marginalized group. But I think it sort of should be common ground that there is epistemic injustice happening in that case against someone. So there can be analogous cases of testimonial withdrawal. The other thing to mention in response to your question is that something can be, can count as, let's call it a regrettable epistemic harm, even without being an epistemic injustice. So, we might reflect on cases like the ones you mentioned, where even if we, just idealize away all unjust power dynamics, you might still be subject to a regrettable epistemic harm. And that might reveal something about how epistemic and practical features of collective inquiry or collective deliberation interact. And in this case, how those practical features can, I think, inhibit inquiry, supposing that you had valuable epistemic goods to share that you chose not to. So I think even if it's not an epistemic injustice, there's still more for us to think about there.
That was very helpful, that clarification. I still want to push back a little bit to see what you think about this, because I'm thinking about how there still might be examples where let's grant that the speaker has a marginalized status. Let's grant that the speech that we're talking about is the relevant kind of speech, content-wise, if that's required. Let's say, okay, I want to push back on, couldn't it still be the case that, like, I as a speaker, the motivations that I have to withdraw my testimony are still like misfiring somehow? So suppose we've got that speaker with marginalized status, race, gender, ability, whatever that is. I like to, by the way, I like to mention to a lot of my students the social science that surrounds the difference that height can make in a person's life. There's some interesting social science about how, like, just an inch of height on average can gain you about $1,000 more in earning potential. And that's across disciplines and genders. And I won't lie, that one hits a little close to home for me. I'm only 5'6", and it sure seems like my height has come up time and time again over my life. Now listen, I beat the genes. My dad is 5'2" and my mom's 5'4". So I always tell my students that, I was born in the Shire to Hobbit. So even though you can't tell, but I can imagine if that's if you don't like that as a status, if that's not the best example, no. Okay, then let me run with that. Let me run with that just for the sake, because I think we could change the example to some other status if it would work. But what if, which is totally untrue of me actually, but like, suppose I just have a chip on my shoulder about my height, which is never, I should mention that maybe it is true. There was a time 15 years ago when faux hawks were actually a cool hairstyle, and I jumped on that bandwagon immediately so that I could milk another inch of height out of my hair. But what if I just go from place to place, from interaction to interaction? And you know what? It's true. It does seem like my height plays, a really insidious role in the way that some people interact with me. Whatever that means. I'm an NBA reporter. I don't know. But I still just am overly anxious all the time about the way that could be playing a role in my interactions with people. And so I end up keeping my mouth shut a lot. In other words, like I've got this high false positive rate, despite the fact that I do have that status and it could actually be relevant. Is that still testimonial withdrawal, do you think?
I mean, it could be. I think so. One thing that pushes me toward thinking that, it might not be is that you have to be able to reasonably expect that there is risk associated with speaking. And so if that could either be, and I guess this is something to think about further, whether that's in a particular instance versus sort of over time, because it sounds like you are maybe globally over time not super reasonable because of these false positives, but maybe in any particular instance, it's less clear whether you're reasonable. But if you're unreasonably making these predictions and actually other people don't have any sort of inclination to punish your speech on the basis of your height, then that it wouldn't count as testimonial withdrawal. I mean, maybe some of the social science that you're citing does support the idea that in certain instances, or when your testimony has a certain kind of content, I'm not quite sure what that would be, people are inclined to punish you for it. Or maybe people are more inclined to punish testimony from shorter speakers generally. Maybe it doesn't interact with content. Then you would be right. But if you're stipulating that across the board, you just have, a chip on your shoulder and that is generating all these false positives in your judgment, then you're not reasonably expecting punishment. You're expecting punishment, but not reasonably.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Let's, maybe it might be helpful to follow up on what you're just saying, punishment. So you do cover this in the paper. Can you talk about the different ways that an audience might punish a speaker such that a speaker foresees that and withdraws their testimony?
Yeah. So I'm using it very broadly. So I think that is helpful to clarify. So, punishments in some cases are quite extreme. So, folks who would be dissidents might choose not to speak because they fear, death or imprisonment as forms of punishment. So both formal punishment and extreme punishment. It might also be something still high stakes, but slightly lower stakes, practical consequence like losing a job in the example that I mentioned before. Or I think in many, everyday cases, it might be various forms of social sanction that can vary in severity. So those might include, forming negative reactive attitudes toward the speaker, or forming, negative judgments about the speaker that might then be taken to license all kinds of bad behavior toward them, or just make bad behavior toward them more likely. So social sanctions, as well as kind of practical high stakes punishments would count.
All right. I want to explore this concept of communicative reciprocation. If I understand your explanation correctly, communicative reciprocation occurs when the audience hears, understands, and believes the speaker and does not punish the speaker for their testimony. So could you give us a couple of examples of when that would be evidenced versus when it wouldn't be evidenced?
Yeah. So this term of communicative reciprocation, it's a term that Dotson uses in her work, and she is taking it from Jennifer Hornsby, and Jennifer Hornsby is using it in this Gricean tradition, where in order for communication to succeed, the hearer has to understand what the speaker is trying to communicate, to get across, and then communication succeeds. And Dotson is using it because that is what is threatened in her cases of epistemic violence. So in testimonial withdrawal, there's no problem of communicative reciprocation in that sense, because, as I said, there's no epistemic failure on the audience's part. But I think what the discussion of testimonial withdrawal shows is that in order to avoid unjustly undermining marginalized testifiers, we need not just communication in the sense that, the hearer understands what I'm saying, but a broader kind of receptivity. And, maybe I should not call it communicative reciprocation, because that might be terminologically confusing since it's associated with this Gricean tradition. But if you don't like that terminology, we might just call it epistemic reciprocity or something. But the point is that for the sake of epistemic justice, in testimonial exchanges, we need to be able to, participate in them without being targeted by systemic constraints that make it unjustly risky to offer testimony. So the idea is that there's a kind of reciprocity that is broader than that Gricean sense of communicative reciprocity that is missing in cases of testimonial withdrawal, because folks are not, more broadly speaking, receptive to what they're hearing.
Well, so far we've focused on kind of everyday, ordinary examples of communication where this kind of testimonial withdrawal could take place. But you also argue that it can take place at the level of, say, of public policy. And so I wanted to bring in this idea of, is there a potential connection between testimonial withdrawal and, say, something like Florida's House Bill 991?
So this bill was under consideration when I was working on this, and I think the bill has since died in Judiciary Committee, which is a good thing. But it was a bill that would make it easier to sue news outlets for defamation because it lowered the standard to prove actual malice. So, I'm not an expert on this, on public policy, that is, but currently cases of defamation against journalists have to show that a statement was made with actual malice, which is with either knowledge that the statement was false or with reckless disregard for whether the statement was false or not. And this bill was aiming to change that so that essentially public figures would be able to sue the media, so to punish them for speaking more easily. The bill would also assume that any statement that was made by an anonymous source is false. And so that would force journalists to reveal their confidential sources. So essentially, the worry about it is that it would cause a lot of journalists to withdraw their testimony on stories, and reasonably so, when that testimony might otherwise be, conveying important information to the public. They would instead choose not to because they would fear being sued for defamation. So a very, clear kind of punishment.
Emily, this has just been fascinating. Before we ask you our final special question, though, I want to give you a chance. Where can people find you, follow your work? Do you have anything you want to plug that's coming down the pike?
Yeah, thanks. I probably, Phil papers or Phil people might be best. I'm not big on social media, though probably that's something I should, work on getting better at for professional networking. I might have a longer exploration of these ideas on testimonial withdrawal coming out soon, but I can't say for sure yet. One other thing to perhaps plug is that there's a volume being edited by John Matheson and Aaron Kreller for Routledge on inquiry. And I just recently submitted my draft of a chapter for that volume on my chapters on epistemic injustice in inquiry. So if you're interested in kind of, my broader thoughts about how epistemic injustice can show up in processes of collective inquiry and how that might affect how we should think about epistemic injustice, and really also how we should think about inquiry, then look out for that. Hopefully the volume will come out in 2025. And I'm really excited to read the rest of it myself as well.
Nice. Very cool. Okay. We have come to that part of the program, James.
Yes, we have.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do it.
You're going to do it this time, right?
This is the most important, most monumental, most consequential question that we ask every single guest. So no pressure whatsoever.
Okay.
Here it goes. So if right after this podcast is done, you sign off, suppose you have two options and you have to pick exactly one of these two options. You could leave and go watch an episode of Seinfeld, or you could leave and go watch an episode of 30 Rock. Which of those two would you choose?
Seinfeld.
Oh, yes.
We started with Plato. She starts by saying that Plato's fun to read. Now she picks Seinfeld. Bruises.
What an awesome guest we've had on today. I'm just going to say.
I can see where I've drawn my loyalties. Are those two shows, like, were the years that they ran for about the same, or am I just like being a 90s kid?
No, they don't overlap, I don't think.
Yeah, I don't think so. 30 Rock came on.
Started 2006.
Yeah, so about 6 or 7 years after Seinfeld.
Yeah, it's just because I'm a 90s kid. You know, I'm an elder millennial, or a geriatric millennial, perhaps. So it's just because of the nostalgia factor. I was sort of not quite yet coming of age when Seinfeld went off the air, and I still remember the watch party for the very last episode where we made muffin tops and all sat around and were very nostalgic for years gone by.
Well, my comedy is definitely losing at this point. I think you're 4 or 5 points ahead.
I'm in the lead. That's right.
Yeah.
So we have certainly enjoyed our conversation today. Our guest has been Dr. Emily McWilliams. We've been talking about testimonial withdrawal and her work in that area. Thank you so much for visiting with us today.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, both for thinking of me and for having me on. And it's nice to get a chance to chat with you again.
Yes, you as well. All right, folks, we will see you next time.
Later on.
Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.